On the east bank of the Moselle, before sunrise, the German guns were not waiting for luck. They were waiting for coordinates. Every path down to the river had been measured. Every likely launch point had been marked. Every strip of open ground between the trees and the water had a number attached to it. If American infantry appeared there, the guns already knew where to fire. That was the beauty of the plan. The river did not have to be wide enough to stop an army forever. It only had to be wide enough to hold men in the open for a few minutes. And on September 7th, 1944, a few minutes on that water should have been enough. The Moselle ran cold and fast below the heights near Dornot, France. In places it was only about 40 meters across, but those 40 meters were not empty space. They were an exposed killing lane watched from the eastern bank, covered by mortars, machine guns, and artillery crews who had rehearsed the answer before the question was asked. Then, at WWII in the morning, a German observer heard the sound he was certain he would never hear. Paddles. Not engines. Not bridge machinery. Not the rumble of tanks forcing a crossing behind a curtain of smoke. Paddles. American soldiers were already on the river. They were packed into rubber assault boats, 12 men at a time, moving by hand through the gray dawn toward a bank that had been pre-registered to kill them. The observer reached for the field telephone. The coordinates were ready. The guns opened, and the boats kept coming. That was the part the German plan had not solved. The Moselle was supposed to be the line where the American rush across France finally stopped. For weeks, the German army had been falling backward faster than its own maps could keep up. Operation Cobra had broken the Normandy front. The Falaise pocket had consumed formations that could not be rebuilt quickly. By late summer, the roads of France were full of shattered German units trying to find a place where geography could do what exhausted men could not. The Moselle looked like that place. It rose from the Vosges, curved through Lorraine, and ran past Metz, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. Around Metz stood old French forts, modernized by the Germans and folded into the Western defensive system. Above the river were heights that gave German observers a cruel advantage. Below them were crossing sites that could be turned into firing tables. From a staff map, it made sense. The Americans were far from Normandy. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Patton's Third Army had moved so fast that it was now running against the limits of fuel, ammunition, trucks, bridging equipment, and time. That mattered. A textbook river crossing was not supposed to look like men paddling into artillery. A textbook crossing meant days of preparation. Artillery to blind the enemy heights. Engineers moving bridging gear forward. Smoke, timing, pontoons, traffic control, armor waiting to exploit the bridgehead. But in early September 1944, Third Army did not have the full textbook. It had men. It had assault boats. It had engineers who could work under fire. And it had an order to keep moving before the German frontier hardened into something far worse. So the 5th Infantry Division was handed the problem. At Dornot, the 11th Infantry Regiment would make the first crossing. Combat engineers would bring the boats forward in darkness. Infantry would load into them before dawn. They would cross before the Germans could see clearly. That was the hope. The hope lasted only a few minutes. The M2 assault boat was not a shield. It was a collapsible craft, light enough to carry, wide enough to cram a squad inside, and fragile enough that the men sitting in it understood exactly what it was not. It was not armor. It was not a bridge. It was not protection. It was a floating promise that if enough men could reach the far bank, the crossing might become real. 12 soldiers climbed into each boat with rifles, ammunition, wet boots, heavy packs, and the private knowledge that nobody could dodge in the middle of a river. Then the engineers pushed them off. The first boat slid into the dark current. The men paddled hard. The eastern bank came slowly closer. Then the water began to erupt. Mortar rounds landed short, throwing sheets of river water into the boats. Artillery burst along the western bank where the next waves were waiting. Machine gun fire cut low across the surface. Men were hit before they could stand. Boats spun, swamped, or drifted downstream, with nobody left paddling straight. For the soldiers inside, the crossing was not a battle line. It was a table-sized piece of canvas in the middle of open water. No foxhole, no wall, no place to become small. Only the rhythm of paddles, the slam of shells, and the far bank that had to arrive before the next round did. Some boats made it. Men tumbled out onto the eastern bank, soaked, stunned, and already under fire. They climbed a steep embankment with rifles held above the mud. They crawled into shallow cover. They fired uphill toward muzzle flashes in the trees and stone positions above them. Behind them, the river did not quiet, because the next boats were launching. This was what disturbed the German observers first, not the attempt. The attempt was dangerous, but understandable. Armies sometimes tried dangerous things at dawn. What made the men on the heights look twice was that the Americans did not stop after the first boats were hit. The gunfire had done what it was designed to do. Boats had been struck. Men had gone into the water. Casualties were obvious from the eastern bank. And still, from the western bank, fresh boats kept coming down to the waterline. Engineers who had just watched a boat disappear went back for another one. Infantry waiting under the trees watched the river tear open in front of them, then stepped out and climbed into the next craft. Not because they thought the river was safe, because men were already on the other side. That one fact changed the meaning of everything. Once the first Americans had reached the eastern bank, the crossing was no longer an abstract order. It was a rescue in motion. Every squad still waiting on the west side knew that the men across the river could not hold alone. They had no tanks. They had no bridge. Their ammunition had to come by boat. Their wounded had to wait by boat. Their survival depended on the next boat. So the next boat went. And then another. By mid-morning, elements of 2 American battalions had crossed at Dornot. They did not hold a deep bridgehead. They held a narrow bight of bank under the eyes of German observers, pressed from the front and both sides, with the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division moving against them. The German counterattacks came hard. The SS troops had combat experience from Normandy. They still had enough organization to mount coordinated pressure. Their job was simple: crush the shallow bridgehead before it could become a bridgehead at all. The Americans dug into whatever ground they had. They fought from orchards, slopes, scattered cover, and muddy folds in the bank. When ammunition ran low, it came across the river in boats. When casualties needed to go back, they went across the same water that was still being shelled. When German armor pressed close, the infantry had to hold without armor of their own. For 3 days, Dornot became the kind of place maps cannot explain. On paper, it was too small, too exposed, too expensive, too difficult to reinforce. But the men there kept holding long after German doctrine said a bridgehead like that should have been erased. And the men behind them kept trying to feed it from the far side of a river that was still under fire. Then, on September 10th, the Americans pulled back. After roughly 72 hours of fighting, the Dornot bridgehead was judged too costly to sustain. The battalions that had crossed in assault boats were ordered back across the Moselle. The withdrawal looked to German commanders like proof. Their calculation had been correct. The river had held, the artillery had worked, the assault boats had been inadequate. A prepared river line, properly covered, could still stop the American advance. For a few hours, that conclusion felt reasonable. Then the same division crossed again. Not at Dornot, 3 kilometers south, at Arnaville. While the fight at Dornot had been consuming German attention, the 10th Infantry Regiment had been preparing another crossing point. Reconnaissance had found a sector where the eastern bank was less punishing, where the ground rose more gently, and where the defenders were not the same concentrated Panzer Grenadiers battering Dornot. On September 10th, the same day the northern bridgehead was being abandoned, new boats hit the water at Arnaville. Again the river was real. Again the boats were exposed. Again the Germans fired. But this time, the defenders facing the crossing could not organize the same kind of armored counterattack. The German strength had been drawn toward Dornot, spent there, fixed there, delayed there. The crossing at Arnaville held. American engineers went to work almost immediately. This is another part of the story that gets lost if the crossing is treated like a single moment of bravery. A river crossing does not succeed because men touch the far bank. It succeeds when the far bank can be fed faster than the enemy can destroy it. So the engineers labored under shell fire, hauling equipment, fighting the current, building the route that would turn a fragile foothold into a military fact. By September 12th, a bridge was operating at Arnaville. Armor crossed. The bridgehead expanded, and the Moselle line, which German planners had needed to hold for weeks, had been cracked in 5 days by infantry, engineers, assault boats, and a willingness to keep paying for each yard of water. Dornot had not been useless because it failed. Dornot had pulled the German fist. It had made the 17th SS concentrate north. It had forced German commanders to spend their best local counterattack strength against a bridgehead that bled, held, and finally withdrew. By the time Arnaville became the real breach, the German defense had already been dragged out of balance. That does not make Dornot a trick. It was not a clean deception plan where every loss had been neatly calculated in advance. It was worse than that, and more human. It was an army trying one crossing, suffering for it, refusing to stop moving, and turning the pressure created by the failure into the opening for the next attempt. German commanders could understand a failed crossing. They could understand a successful crossing. What shook them was the space between those two things. The Americans had tried, paid heavily, withdrawn, and then used the same kind of boats on the same river to try again before the Germans had finished congratulating themselves. That was the new variable. Not superior elegance, not perfect planning, not immunity to casualties, persistence under known fire. The German reports from the Moselle fighting showed the change in tone. At first, there was confidence. The bridgehead at Dornot had been contained. The Americans were taking losses. The defense was working. After Arnaville held and the bridge went in, the language grew colder. The Germans had not been wrong about the river. They had not been wrong about the heights. They had not been wrong about the artillery effects on open boats. Their weapons had performed within expectations. Their expectation of human behavior had not. They had assumed that after a certain level of loss, a river assault would become irrational to continue. That was not a foolish assumption. Militaries make those calculations because men are not machines, and casualties change what units can bear. But on the Moselle, the expected breaking point did not appear where the Germans thought it would. The boats kept coming after the first losses. They kept coming after the river was registered. They kept coming after the men on the western bank could see exactly what had happened to the men in the first waves, not because American commanders were careless with lives. The casualty lists from those days say otherwise, and not because the men in the boats were fearless. Letters, interviews, and unit memories make that impossible to believe. They were afraid. Of course they were afraid. A man sitting upright in a canvas boat under artillery fire does not need a historian to explain danger to him. But fear was not the only force in that boat. There was training. There was pressure. There was momentum. There was the knowledge that the Army could not wait forever for perfect equipment and perfect conditions. And there was something simpler than all of it. The men on the far bank were waiting. That is why a German artillery officer could look at his results and still feel that the answer was missing. The guns had found the boats. The shells had landed in the right places. The casualties were not imaginary. The defensive plan had done what it was designed to do. Yet the attack had not stopped. By September 12th, the Moselle had been crossed in force at Arnaville. The river no longer protected Metz in the way German planners required. Once American troops and armor were east of the river south of the city, Metz began changing from a fortress barrier into a problem that could be bypassed, tightened, and reduced. The forts still mattered. The city still took time. Metz would not fully fall until November. But the operational meaning of Metz had changed. The river line had not held long enough to rebuild the German defense west of the frontier. It had not bought the weeks it was supposed to buy. It had been breached by men who arrived without enough fuel, without enough bridging equipment, and without the luxury of waiting until the crossing made sense. That is what the Moselle taught the German army. Every later river defense had to assume that the boats might come anyway, not when the conditions were ideal, not when the defenders were blind, not when the artillery had been silenced. Anyway, because on a September morning near Dornot, German observers watched men paddle into a place that had been measured to kill them. They watched the shells land. They watched boats break. They watched bodies. and equipment go into the current, and then they watch the next boat push off. That was the part no firing table contained. A river can be measured. A current can be estimated. A bank can be registered. A shell can be corrected. But the willingness of the next 12 men to climb into the boat after seeing what happened to the last 12 is not a fixed number. It belongs to the unit, to the mission, to the man beside you, to the men already across. The Germans had measured the Moselle almost perfectly. They measured the width, they measured the approaches, they measured the range from the heights to the water. They measured everything except the thing that mattered most. The next boat.